So, at this point, I am over 200 shorts deep in my reviews of the designs of various Pokemon, and there's one aspect of trying to research and write these shorts which can be especially vexing sometimes, and that is establishing the origins and the inspiration behind a particular design. Bulbapedia and other fan sources will often list popular theories about Pokemon origins, but not being scholarly publications, they are under no obligation to cite sources, and so I have to do the research on my own. Sometimes it's very easy because the creators have openly named the inspiration for a design. Did You Know Gaming, for example, translated an interview with Ken Sugimori from 2003 where he laid out plainly that he based Torchic, Combusken, and Blaziken on the concept of painted chicks, adorable baby chickens which are purchased and then usually thrown out, abandoned, or killed once they stop being cute. According to Sugimori, he wanted to test the players of Pokemon to see if they would abandon their adorable baby Torchic once they saw it turn into the walking penis monster that is Combusken and then an edgy kick fighter like Blaziken. Which, you know, Rule 34 makes fools of us all eventually, and I guess he just didn't realize how appealing some people were going to find it. But that's a very explicit design inspiration. Straight from the horse's mouth, it is confirmed. That one is easy. And even without explicit confirmation, sometimes it's just completely obvious. Take Ho-Oh, for example. Ho-Oh is a Chinese firebird, a Fenghuang, because, well, it just obviously is. For one thing, another word for the Fenghuang is Ho-Oh, and for another, historical depictions of the Fenghuang are functionally identical to the basics of Ho-Oh's character design, especially its color scheme and its association with rainbows. You could maybe make the argument that Ho-Oh is also based on other versions of the Phoenix, which, like, okay, sure, that's not theoretically impossible, but from the name to the character design, it is painfully obvious to me that the Fenghuang is the inspiration for Ho-Oh, to the point that I think it's basically impossible to argue otherwise in good faith. Like, you would have to be deliberately obtuse in order not to see it. You would have to be doing a bit or something. It isn't always that easy and clear-cut, though. Lots of Pokemon designs pull from multiple sources, and it can take some work to figure out which interpretations of a design are credible and which aren't. For example, let's look at Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza, the Weather Trio. Now, in Hebrew mythology, there is also a trio of monsters: Behemoth, the great beast of the land, Leviathan, the great beast of the sea, and Ziz, the great beast of the sky. And it is said in some legends that Behemoth and Leviathan are destined to clash in an apocalyptic struggle at the end of time. Immediately, this seems like an extremely appealing interpretation of the Weather Trio. Groudon is Behemoth, Kyogre is Leviathan, and Rayquaza is Ziz. The triumvirate fits them perfectly, and it even comes with a clear reason for Kyogre and Groudon to fight. Clearly, this must have been part of the inspiration. Right? Well, except when you look a little bit closer, you start to run into some problems with that idea. For example, Behemoth is usually described much more in terms of an ox or a buffalo or some kind of a cattle. According to the Book of Job, he eats grass, he lays down beneath lotuses in the cover of swamp reeds, and rests among the willows of the brook, and that doesn't really map onto Groudon almost at all. Groudon is some mixture of a pangolin and a mole and a lizard, and it sleeps in magma and raises volcanoes. It doesn't nap in ponds beneath lotus flowers. Behemoth also doesn't have any special power over the land as such. He's said to be able to stop the flow of a river with his body if he wants to and be untamable and undefeatable in combat, but that's about it. He is mostly just a really big monster. Similarly, Leviathan is usually described not in terms of a whale, but of a sea serpent, something akin to Jormungandr out of Norse mythology. Leviathan was said to breathe fire like a dragon and have impenetrable fish scales and be impervious to everything except the might of God, and while it could boil the seas with its hot breath, it had no particularly special power over the oceans. And as for Ziz, well, Ziz is a bird. Sometimes it's described somewhat like a griffin, but mostly it's just described as a bloody huge bird, and it doesn't have any special power over the sky. And it certainly has no special power over Behemoth and Leviathan like what Rayquaza has. So while initially it is very compelling to think of the Weather Trio as an interpretation of Behemoth, Leviathan, and Ziz, when you actually look into it, they don't really seem to be inspired by those figures. Almost at all, frankly. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that the inspiration is impossible. I don't know what was going through the designers' minds at Game Freak, but if that is the inspiration, then it's a pretty weak inspiration, and clearly there were other things that were more influential on the design of the trio. You can absolutely decide to read the Weather Trio through the lens of Hebrew myth, and those readings might produce some really interesting interpretations, but I don't think there's a strong argument to be made that the Weather Trio were inspired by or supposed to recall the chaos monsters of Hebrew mythology. I think the overlap between them is much more of a coincidence. The triumvirate of land, sea, and air is fairly universal, like it exists in a lot of cultures, and I find it substantially more likely, and more fitting, that Kyogre and Groudon were inspired by simple, natural forces, erosion from the sea and volcanic activity from the land. Groudon looks like a walking magma lizard. Kyogre looks like 6 different ocean creatures, so it fits their designs quite well, and it positions Rayquaza as a representative of the divine, i.e. the only power that human beings can turn to save them when the forces of nature run amok, which is exactly something that is part of Rayquaza's narrative. It also works really well with Rayquaza looking like a dragon, because that is a classical and extremely popular representation of heavenly divine power. Now, I can't claim for a fact that the Weather Trio was inspired only by natural forces and divine dragons. Again, I don't have confirmation from Game Freak, but I think as an interpretation, it is much stronger and aligns much better with what is in evidence in the character designs. Now, there's also the theory that Rayquaza takes something from Quetzalcoatl, the great feathered serpent of Aztec myth, and I think this idea is a lot stronger than the Hebrew myth interpretation. Quetzalcoatl explicitly had power over the winds and was associated with the sky and with the stars, and he was probably something of a protector god. Quetzalcoatl was also said to be feathered like a quetzal bird, which is a green bird, and certain depictions of the god have reasonable similarity with Rayquaza's body plan. It's certainly a lot closer in similarity than Behemoth and Leviathan are to Groudon and Kyogre. Still, this too is not a Ho-Oh-style obvious undeniable theory, because Quetzalcoatl was very explicitly a feathered serpent. Like, that's literally what his name means. It is his primary physical trait. And whatever else Rayquaza is, it definitely is not feathered. What Rayquaza does have, though, is arms, and Quetzalcoatl, being a serpent, very much doesn't, at least not in any of the depictions that I was able to find of its serpent body. Rayquaza is a dragon, like down to the typing, and as I pointed out in my review, it seems to be designed less to evoke the distant mythical past, and much more to evoke modernity and technology. Its fins and head crest look like the ailerons on a missile, and its segmented body construction recalls robots and aircraft. Rayquaza seems to be designed to look sleek and fast and aerodynamic in the visual language of fighter jets and spacecraft, not so much in the visual language of ancient myth. Now again, none of this is to say that it's impossible that Rayquaza took inspiration from Quetzalcoatl. I would certainly accept that interpretation. But if you compare and contrast Rayquaza with the pop culture depiction of Asian-style dragons which usually do have the dinky little arms that Rayquaza does, I would argue that that is a much more obvious source of inspiration, and short of actual confirmation from Game Freak, I don't think that Rayquaza looks more like a feathered sky serpent than it does like Shenron from Dragon Ball. Anyway, that is the assessment process that I use when I try to determine what was likely to be the inspiration for a given Pokemon's design. I Google around, I check fan forums, I try to find out what theories are out there, and I give them a quick look to figure out if they seem credible. And if they don't, well, I usually just don't bring them up. You can rarely get more than 230 words into a 60-second video, so there's almost never time to both debunk a theory and attempt to review a design. Plus, in my experience, the primary thing you get when you debunk a popular fan theory is a whole bunch of comments arguing over the fan theory, and those can turn really nasty really fast, and moderating them can get really stressful. It's just not worth the trouble most of the time. So, if you're ever watching one of my Pokemon shorts and you go, hey, why didn't he bring up that theory or mention that thing? He must have missed it. Well, 9 times out of 10, I do know about the thing, but I decided not to bring it up, either because I find it to be an unlikely fan theory, or because it's just not relevant and wouldn't change my conclusion, or because it's a 60-second short and you just can't get everything into all of them.